You don't put handcuffs on a woman like that, unless you're ready for what comes next. The morning air sat heavy over the intersection of 8th Avenue and Madison, the kind of late summer heat that clung to your skin and slowed everything down just enough for people to notice when something wasn't right. And that's exactly what began to happen as a patrol car eased to a stop at the curb, its presence quiet but commanding, drawing eyes without needing sirens, without needing urgency, just authority. And standing there on the sidewalk was a woman who didn't look like trouble, didn't look like someone who belonged in a scene like this. Her posture straight, her expression calm, her presence almost still against the moving backdrop of the city, dressed in a tailored navy blazer that caught the light just enough to suggest precision, not flash. Her gaze steady, not defiant, not afraid, just aware, as if she had already seen this moment before it unfolded. And maybe that was what unsettled Officer Daniel Brooks the most as he stepped out of the vehicle, his boots hitting the pavement with that familiar rhythm of control, his partner Kyle Mercer close behind, both of them scanning her not as a person, but as a problem to be solved, something that didn't quite fit where it stood, something that needed to be questioned, corrected, contained, and the crowd didn't form all at once. It never does. It starts with one glance, then another, then a pause that lingers too long, until suddenly there are phones half raised, conversations cut short, strangers turning into witnesses without realizing they've already chosen a side. And through it all, she didn't move. Not when Brooks spoke. Not when his tone sharpened just enough to turn curiosity into command. Not when he asked questions that weren't really questions at all. And for a moment, just a moment, the entire street seemed to narrow down to that space between them, where authority met something it didn't recognize, something it couldn't immediately define, and that made it dangerous, or at least that's how he saw it, because in his world, uncertainty wasn't something you paused for, it was something you controlled, and so his hand moved, not violently, not dramatically, just decisively, reaching for the cuffs like it was procedure, like it was routine, like this was just another stop. In a long shift that would blur together by the end of the day, and still, she didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, her only response coming in a tone so even it almost disappeared beneath the noise of the city. "You're making a mistake," she said, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a fact, the kind of statement that doesn't ask to be believed, only remembered. And maybe it was the way she said it, or maybe it was the way she looked at him, not past him, not through him, but directly at him, like she understood something he didn't, something just out of reach, because Brooks hesitated, just for a second, a flicker of doubt he buried almost immediately beneath the weight of his badge, the presence of the crowd, the need to be right, always right, especially now, and somewhere in that growing silence, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the quiet buzz of recording phones, the moment locked into place, unnoticed by most, but irreversible all the same. Because what they were about to do wasn't just another routine stop, and what he was about to set in motion wasn't something he could undo, not with authority, not with excuses, not even with time, because some mistakes don't reveal themselves right away. They wait, patient, quiet, until the exact moment when everything changes all at once. The metal clicked into place with a sound that carried farther than it should have, sharp and final, cutting through the low murmur of the street as if the entire city had paused just long enough to hear it. And in that instant something shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the air itself had grown heavier, thicker, charged with a tension no one could quite explain, and yet everyone could feel. Because moments like this have a way of pulling people in, of turning ordinary passers-by into silent observers. And now there were more of them, phones raised higher, voices lowered to whispers, eyes locked on the woman who stood there with her hands secured, but her posture unchanged, her shoulders still squared, her chin level, her expression not hardened but steady, controlled, the kind of calm that does not come from ignorance but from certainty. And Officer Daniel Brooks mistook that calm for compliance, for surrender. Because that is what he had always been taught to see, what he expected to see. And expectation has a way of shaping reality, at least for a while. "You should have cooperated," he said, his voice firm but edged with something else now, something that sounded almost like reassurance, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as anyone else, while Kyle Mercer glanced toward the growing crowd, shifting his weight slightly. aware now that this was no longer just another stop, that this moment was being recorded, from angles they could not control, preserved in real time by people who did not know the full story but did not need to in order to form an opinion. And still, procedure moved forward, because that is what procedure does. It keeps going even when something feels off, even when a quiet voice somewhere deep beneath the surface begins to ask questions no one wants to answer. And Brooks reached for the radio at his shoulder, his thumb pressing the button with practiced ease, requesting confirmation, running her name, waiting for the familiar rhythm of dispatch to come back with something that would justify everything, something that would lock this moment into place as correct, necessary, routine. But the response did not come as quickly as expected, and that delay, small as it was, stretched just enough to be noticed, just enough to let doubt breathe. And for the first time since stepping out of the patrol car, Brooks looked at her again, really looked, not at her clothes or her stance or the assumptions he had already made, but at her eyes, and what he saw there was not fear, not anger, not even defiance, but patience, the kind of patience that does not rush, that does not panic, that waits because it knows something is coming. And she spoke again, her voice just above the hum of the city, calm and measured. I would advise you to reconsider what you are doing. And there it was again, not a threat, not a plea, just a statement, simple and direct, and for a brief moment the noise of the street seemed to pull back, like a tide retreating before something larger rolls in, and Mercer shifted again, his eyes flicking toward Brooks, then back to her, uncertainty creeping in at the edges, because something about this did not align, did not follow the pattern they were used to. And patterns matter. Patterns are how decisions are made quickly, how control is maintained. But this, whatever this was, did not fit. And yet Brooks pressed forward, because stopping now would mean questioning everything that led up to this point. And that is not something people do easily, not in front of a crowd, not with a badge on their chest, not when the world is watching. And so the moment continued, locked in motion, even as the first cracks began to form beneath the surface, invisible to most, but already spreading, already setting the stage for what would come next. The radio finally responded, but not in the way Officer Daniel Brooks expected, the usual steady voice from dispatch replaced by a pause, a hesitation that stretched just long enough to be noticed, followed by a tone that had subtly changed, more careful now, more precise, as if each word was being weighed before it was released into the air. Unit 12, please confirm identification again. And that alone was enough to shift something inside him, because dispatch did not ask twice unless something did not line up, unless something in the system had triggered a flag that could not be ignored. And Brooks felt it then, not fear, not yet, but the faint edge of uncertainty pressing against the confidence he had been carrying since the moment he stepped out of the car. And beside him Kyle Mercer straightened slightly, his attention sharpening as the atmosphere around them began to tighten, the crowd sensing it too without understanding why, their murmurs softening into a quieter, more focused silence, phones still raised but now steadier, more deliberate, as if everyone instinctively knew they were no longer watching something routine. And through it all she remained exactly as she had been, unmoved, unshaken, her eyes following Brooks with a calm that felt almost out of place against the growing tension. And then she did something small, something so simple it might have gone unnoticed if not for the weight of everything around it. She tilted her head slightly and spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for him to hear. You might want to listen carefully to what comes through that radio. And there was no urgency in her voice, no attempt to rush him, only certainty. And that certainty landed heavier than any raised voice ever could, because it did not ask for attention, it assumed it. And Brooks felt his grip on the situation begin to shift, just slightly, just enough to make him aware that control was no longer as solid as it had been a minute ago. And he pressed the radio again, repeating the information, his tone firmer this time, as if clarity alone could restore order. But the response that came back was different now, unmistakably different. Stand by for supervisory confirmation. And that was when the first real crack appeared, because supervisory confirmation meant escalation. It meant someone higher up had been alerted. It meant this moment had just moved beyond them, beyond a simple stop, beyond something they could resolve on their own terms. And Mercer's eyes flicked toward Brooks again, a silent question passing between them, one that neither of them voiced, because to say it out loud would make it real, would force them to confront the possibility that they had misread something fundamental from the very beginning, and the crowd leaned in closer without stepping forward, drawn by the invisible shift in power that was beginning to unfold. And still, she waited, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged, as if time itself had slowed around her while everything else struggled to keep up. And for a brief moment Brooks considered it, the possibility that she was not who he thought she was, that this situation was not what it appeared to be. But the thought came too late, because once a decision is made in front of witnesses, in front of cameras, in front of a world that is already watching, reversing it is no longer simple. It is no longer clean, and pride has a way of filling the space where doubt tries to grow, pushing it back, silencing it. And so he stood there, waiting for the next transmission, unaware that the moment he was standing in had already begun to turn, that somewhere beyond the reach of his radio, beyond the limits of his authority, something had already been set in motion, something that would not ask for permission, something that would not wait much longer. The seconds stretched longer than they should have, each one carrying a weight that settled into the space between them. And when the radio finally came alive again, it did not sound like routine anymore. It sounded controlled, deliberate, the kind of voice that does not belong to dispatch alone. Unit 12, remain on scene. Do not proceed further. Supervisor en route. And that was the moment everything shifted, not visibly, not all at once, but underneath, where certainty begins to loosen and control starts to slip through the cracks. And Officer Daniel Brooks felt it whether he wanted to admit it or not. Because those were not words you heard during a normal stop. Those were words that meant pause, that meant wait, that meant something bigger had just stepped into the situation. And beside him, Kyle Mercer exhaled slowly, his eyes scanning the street again, noticing details he had ignored before. The way the crowd had grown thicker, the way people were no longer just watching but focusing, recording with intent, capturing every second as if they understood that whatever was happening here was no longer ordinary. And in the center of it all she stood exactly the same, hands secured but presence untouched, her calm no longer just noticeable but defining, shaping the moment around her instead of reacting to it. And Brooks shifted his stance slightly, adjusting his grip on authority the only way he knew how, by holding onto it tighter, by refusing to let the change in tone affect the narrative he had already committed to, because stepping back now would not just be a correction, it would be an admission, and that was something he was not prepared to face. Not here, not like this. And so he spoke again, louder this time, more for the crowd than for her. You are being detained until we verify your information. The words sounding firm but lacking the certainty they carried just minutes ago, and she looked at him, not with resistance, not with frustration, but with something quieter, something almost reflective, as if she were observing not just him but the moment itself. And then she took a slow breath and spoke once more, her voice steady, measured. You have already verified more than you realize. And that sentence lingered, hanging in the air longer than it should have, because it did not explain itself. It did not need to. It simply existed, waiting to be understood, and Mercer felt it then, the shift becoming clearer, the unease settling in deeper, because nothing about this followed the pattern they were used to. There was no escalation, no panic, no attempt to argue or plead, only stillness, only patience. And that kind of response does not come from uncertainty. It comes from knowing exactly how things are going to unfold. And somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of another vehicle approaching began to cut through the background noise, low at first, then gradually clearer, and Brooks turned his head slightly. Just enough to acknowledge it, just enough to recognize that whatever was coming was not just reinforcement, not just backup, but something else entirely, something that had been set in motion the moment that radio call hesitated, the moment the system paused instead of confirming, and the crowd felt it too, their murmurs fading into a quiet anticipation, because people know when a story is about to turn, even if they do not know how. And in that suspended space, between what had already happened and what was about to arrive, one thing became undeniable. This moment was no longer theirs to control. It never had been, and they were only just beginning to understand that. The approaching vehicle did not arrive with urgency. No flashing lights cutting through the street, no sirens demanding attention, and somehow that made it more noticeable, more significant, because it moved with purpose instead of noise. A dark government sedan easing into view at the far end of the block, its presence quiet but commanding in a way that did not need to announce itself. And as it rolled closer, the subtle shift in the crowd became undeniable, people stepping slightly aside. Without being told, their attention narrowing, their instincts recognizing something official, something beyond the usual rhythm of city patrols, and Officer Daniel Brooks saw it too, though he could not yet explain why it unsettled him, because it did not match the pattern of backup he was used to. It did not carry the familiar markings or signals that would have reassured him that this situation was still within his control. And beside him, Kyle Mercer straightened instinctively, his posture tightening as the sedan came to a smooth stop along the curb, its engine idling softly like a held breath. And for a moment no one moved, the kind of pause that stretches just long enough to make every second feel deliberate, until the driver's door opened with quiet precision and a man stepped out, dressed not in uniform but in a tailored suit that spoke of a different kind of authority, the kind that does not patrol streets but directs those who do. And his eyes scanned the scene quickly, efficiently, taking in details without hesitation, the crowd, the officers, and finally settling on the woman at the center of it all. And something in his expression shifted the moment he saw her. Not surprise, not confusion, but recognition, immediate and absolute. And that was when the tension in the air changed completely, no longer uncertain but focused, like a story finally reaching the point where everything begins to align. And Brooks felt it before he understood it. That quiet loss of footing that comes when a situation moves beyond your reach. And still he held his ground, because stepping back now would mean acknowledging what he had not yet fully grasped, and the man approached without hurry, his steps measured, controlled, each one closing the distance with a calm that mirrored hers. And when he stopped a few feet away, his voice was low but carried easily, cutting through the silence without needing to rise. "Ma'am," he said, a single word that held more weight than anything spoken so far, and Brooks turned slightly, confusion edging into his expression as he looked between them, because that tone was not directed at him, not even shared with him, it was given to her. And in that moment the balance shifted again, more clearly this time, because respect had entered the scene, and it had not come from the crowd. It had come from somewhere higher, somewhere beyond the authority Brooks thought he held. And the woman lifted her gaze just slightly, acknowledging the man with the same calm she had carried from the beginning. And though her hands remained secured, her presence had already begun to change the space around her, and the man's attention moved briefly to the cuffs, then back to her, his expression tightening just enough to signal that something here was not acceptable, not within the rules he operated under. And Mercer felt it fully now, the realization settling in with a quiet certainty that could not be ignored, that they had stepped into something far beyond a routine stop, something structured, something protected, something that had already been recognized long before they understood it. And the crowd leaned in closer without moving, drawn by the unfolding shift in power, because what they were witnessing was no longer just an encounter, it was a moment of reversal. And though Brooks had not yet said it, had not yet allowed himself to think it clearly, the truth was already there, waiting just beneath the surface, ready to reveal itself at any second. For a moment no one spoke, not even the crowd. Not even the distant hum of traffic seemed to intrude on the stillness that had settled over the scene, because something fundamental had just shifted and everyone could feel it, even if they did not yet understand it. And the man in the suit took one small step closer, his attention fixed on her with a level of focus that left no room for doubt. "General Hayes," he said quietly, and the name landed with a weight that rippled outward, subtle at first, then unmistakable, like a signal finally breaking through static. And Kyle Mercer felt it immediately, the title alone enough to rearrange everything he thought he knew about this moment, because that was not a name you heard casually, not a rank you misused. And his eyes moved quickly from her to Brooks, searching for some sign that this was still under control, but there was none, because Brooks had gone still, completely still, his posture locked in place as the realization began to surface, slow and unwelcome. And the crowd reacted in waves, whispers rising, phones lifting higher, the energy shifting from curiosity to something sharper, something closer to disbelief. And through it all she remained exactly as she had been, composed, steady, her gaze now meeting the man's with quiet acknowledgement, not surprise, not relief, just recognition, as if this was the moment she had been waiting for all along. And the man's eyes moved once more to the cuffs at her wrists, his expression tightening just enough to signal that this was not acceptable, not in any version of protocol he understood. And when he spoke again, his voice was still calm, but carried a new edge, one that did not need to raise itself to be heard. "Remove them," he said, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a certainty that left no room for interpretation, and Brooks felt the words hit harder than any command he had received all day, because this one did not come from his chain of command. It came from somewhere above it, somewhere that did not need to explain itself. And for a second, just a second, he hesitated, caught between what he had already done and what he was now being told to undo. And in that hesitation, everything became clear, because hesitation is where truth lives. It is where the mind finally catches up to the moment. And Mercer took a small step back, instinctively creating distance, not from her, but from the mistake that was now fully visible. And the crowd leaned in without moving, their silence louder than any reaction, because they knew what they were witnessing, the exact point where authority begins to collapse under the weight of reality. And Brooks moved then, slowly, deliberately, his hands no longer steady with confidence, but guided by something else now, something closer to urgency. And as the cuffs were finally released, the sound was softer than before, but it carried far more meaning, because this time it did not signal control, it signaled the loss of it. And she lowered her hands without rushing, without reacting, simply returning to stillness as if nothing about her had changed, even though everything around her had. And when she spoke, her voice was as calm as ever, but now it carried something new, something undeniable. "I told you," she said, not as a reprimand, not as a triumph, but as a simple truth. And in that moment, Officer Daniel Brooks understood something he could not undo, something that would follow him long after this street emptied and the cameras stopped recording, because the power he thought he held had never been his to begin with, and now everyone could see it. The shift did not end with the sound of metal releasing. It only began there, because once the illusion of control breaks, it does not quietly repair itself. It unravels, piece by piece, and Officer Daniel Brooks felt that unraveling in the way the air around him changed, in the way the crowd no longer looked at him the same, in the way the silence now carried judgment instead of curiosity. And before he could gather his thoughts, the man in the suit had already stepped slightly forward, positioning himself not as a participant but as a boundary, a line that had been drawn too late but would not be crossed again. "General Hayes, are you all right?" he asked, his tone measured but carrying a level of concern that made it clear where his allegiance stood. And she gave a small nod, nothing dramatic, nothing exaggerated, just acknowledgement, because she did not need to prove anything, not anymore. And that quiet response seemed to settle something invisible yet powerful, like a confirmation that the moment had fully turned. And Brooks opened his mouth, as if to speak, as if to explain, to correct, to regain some version of authority, but the words did not come, because there was no version of this that could be explained away, not with cameras still recording, not with witnesses standing only feet away, not with the weight of that title now hanging over everything he had done. And beside him, Kyle Mercer took another small step back, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because he understood now that this was no longer their situation to manage, that it had moved into a space where their actions were no longer decisions but evidence. And the man in the suit turned slightly, his attention shifting just enough to include both officers without fully acknowledging them. And when he spoke again, his voice was calm, but carried a finality that did not invite response. "We will take it from here." And those words landed with quiet authority, not loud, not forceful, but absolute. The kind of statement that closes a door without needing to slam it. And Brooks felt the ground beneath his position give way completely, because in that moment he was no longer the one in charge, not even close. And the radio at his shoulder crackled again, this time sharper, more urgent. "Unit 12, confirm status immediately." And the voice from dispatch no longer sounded routine. It sounded aware, as if the situation had already escalated beyond the street, beyond the local chain of command. And Brooks hesitated again, but this time the hesitation was different, heavier, because it carried consequence. And when he finally reached for the radio, his hand was not as steady as before. His response shorter, less certain. Status. Updated. He said, the words incomplete, insufficient, and the crowd absorbed every second of it, every pause, every shift, because this was no longer just a moment of conflict. It was a moment of exposure, and she stood at the center of it all, not elevated, not dramatic, just present, her composure unchanged, her silence now louder than anything anyone else could say. And then she turned slightly, not away from them but beyond them, her attention moving past the immediate scene as if she had already stepped into what came next. And when she spoke, her voice remained calm, precise. I need a secure line. And the man in the suit nodded without hesitation, already reaching for his phone, already moving with the efficiency of someone who understood exactly what that request meant. And Brooks felt it then, fully and unmistakably, the realization that whatever happened next would not involve him, would not require him, and would not protect him, because the moment he thought he controlled had already moved on without him, leaving only the consequences behind. The phone was already in the man's hand before the request had fully settled into the air, his movements precise, practiced, as if this was not an unusual moment, but one he had prepared for long before it arrived. And when he extended the device toward her, it was not offered casually. It was presented with intention, with an understanding that what was about to happen would not belong to this street, to this crowd, or to the officers standing just a few feet away. And General Amara Hayes accepted it without hesitation, her fingers steady, her posture unchanged, as if the weight of the moment had no effect on her at all. And for a brief second the world seemed to narrow again, the noise of the city fading into something distant, something irrelevant, because every eye was now fixed on her, every breath held in quiet anticipation. And when she raised the phone to her ear, she did not rush. She did not speak immediately. She waited, just long enough for the silence to deepen, just long enough for the tension to settle into something almost tangible. And then she spoke, her voice low but unmistakably clear. This is General Amara Hayes. I need immediate confirmation with the Pentagon. And the words landed differently than anything before them. Not because they were louder, not because they were forceful, but because they carried authority that did not need to prove itself, authority that simply existed. And for a moment, there was no response, just the faint sound of a connection being established, the quiet shift of a line opening somewhere far beyond this street, far beyond the reach of local radios and patrol procedures. And Brooks felt it then, fully and completely, the moment slipping entirely out of his hands, because whatever came next would not be decided here, would not be handled within the boundaries he understood. And the crowd leaned in without stepping closer, drawn by the gravity of what they were witnessing, because even without knowing the details they could feel the scale of it, the difference between a routine call and something that reached far higher, far deeper. And she listened for a moment, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady, and when she spoke again it was with the same calm precision. Yes, I am on location. There has been a procedural error that requires immediate attention, and that word, error, seemed to echo in a way nothing else had, because it was simple, controlled, but carried consequences far beyond its size. And the man in the suit stood beside her, silent but attentive, already aware that whatever was being set in motion would move quickly, would not linger, would not wait. And Brooks glanced at Mercer, a silent exchange passing between them, one filled not with confusion now, but with realization, because the situation had fully transformed, from uncertainty to clarity, from control to exposure. And the radio at Brooks's shoulder crackled again, louder this time, sharper. Unit 12, stand by for direct orders. And that tone, that urgency, confirmed what he already knew but had not yet accepted, that this was no longer a local matter, that it had moved into a space where decisions would be made without him, about him. And the crowd held its breath as she lowered the phone, slightly, listening, absorbing whatever was being said on the other end. And though her expression did not change, something in the air did, something final, something irreversible, because the moment of reveal had passed, and now came the moment of consequence, and there was nothing left to stop it. When she finally lowered the phone, the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was settled, defined. The kind of silence that comes after a decision has already been made somewhere far beyond the reach of the people standing on that street. And General Amara Hayes handed the device back with the same calm precision she had shown from the beginning, her movements unhurried, her expression unchanged, but the atmosphere around her had shifted completely, no longer tense, no longer suspended, but resolved, and the man in the suit received the phone with a slight nod, already understanding what had been set in motion, already preparing for what would follow. And before anyone else could speak the radio at Officer Daniel, Brooks's shoulder came alive again, sharper than before, carrying a tone that did not belong to routine communication. Unit 12, stand down immediately and await supervisory directive. And the words landed with finality, not open to interpretation, not open to delay, and Brooks felt them settle into him like weight. Because this was the moment where everything became official, where the shift that had been building was now confirmed, documented, irreversible, and beside him Kyle Mercer remained still, his earlier uncertainty now replaced by a quiet acceptance, because there was nothing left to question, nothing left to defend, only the reality of what had already happened and what was now unfolding in response to it. And the crowd absorbed it all in silence, their phones still raised, capturing the exact point where authority had been redirected, where the story they thought they were watching had turned into something else entirely. And General Hayes adjusted her jacket slightly, a small, composed gesture that carried more presence than any reaction could have. And when she spoke, her voice remained steady, measured, but now it carried a clarity that left no space for misunderstanding. This situation will be reviewed through the appropriate channels, she said, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact, and that was all it needed to be. Because the weight behind those words did not come from volume or emotion, it came from the system that stood behind her, the system that had already responded, already acted, already begun to move in ways that could not be undone. And Brooks looked at her then, really looked, not through the lens of assumption or authority, but with the understanding that had come too late. And in that look was the realization that the moment he thought he controlled had never belonged to him, that the power he relied on had limits he had never considered until now, and that crossing those limits had consequences that would not disappear when the crowd did, would not fade when the street returned to normal. And the man in the suit stepped slightly forward again, his presence quiet but definitive, signaling that the situation had fully transitioned out of their hands, and one by one the unspoken roles in the scene began to realign. The officers no longer at the center, the crowd no longer just observing, and General Hayes standing exactly where she had been from the beginning, unchanged, steady, because she had never needed the moment to shift in order to hold her ground. And as the first signs of official response began to approach in the distance, subtle but unmistakable, one truth settled over everything that had happened, clear and unshakable, that authority without understanding is fragile, and the moment it is tested by truth, it does not stand, it falls quietly, right in front of everyone.